All right, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Dr. Robert Roten, the CEO of the Arizona Trauma Institute, and I'm going to talk about, I think, a very important topic today, and that topic is the fact that trauma therapy is different than standard therapy. And I want to lay out the differences and why it is not the same thing. So I'm going to move through this. I'm going to move through it pretty quickly. Our goal is this to be about a 90-minute presentation, and I hope that you find some benefit in it. So let's continue. Typically in our culture, how trauma has been defined is a big, bad, ugly event of some kind. The diagnostic category really says, it's about an event that happens. However, this is really an inadequate explanation, primarily because if we define trauma that way, then no one's traumatized that isn't having a single big bad event. But what happens to the people that are living in constant adversity, that are constantly stressed, and they are not diagnosed as having trauma? However, what I want to impress upon you is trauma is generated by changes in the body and the nervous system, and that those changes can permanently change how the body functions. That trauma is really more about a body response than anything to do with a particular event. Even an event triggers a response in the body, and it is the response in the body that is problematic, not the event. The human body is designed to be environmentally reactive and adaptive. So what we're often seeing that's being labeled as pathology or problem behaviors are actually biologically correct processes. In other words, there's a natural, predictable biological response to having someone in a overly stressed or traumatic state. So I like the description by Dr. Robert Macy, who says trauma is an overwhelming demand placed upon the physiological human system. In other words, there's too much weighing on that system for the system to function as it's designed, to function in a well-balanced, a useful way. And when the system moves out of balance, there is tremendous effects that occur both in the body and in the thinking and in the emotions and the behaving that people go into. So let's look at the simple differences in therapy. A lot of the therapy models that are out there are what we would consider neocortex centric. In other words, they're learning based. They include all of the cognitive and cognitive behavioral forms of therapy. They are highly manualized. They are highly dependent on instruction. They tend to be homework heavy. Those are kind of the common, and they assume that the person has a clear ability to think and use their executive functioning system. The other relatively common forms of therapy are what we might call amygdala-centric. And these are the therapies that focus on negative, intense emotions. These include psychodynamic approaches and a lot of therapy modalities that focus on feelings and emotions as the primary focus of treatment. So trauma therapy, for particularly when we move past a single event but into a more complex process of trauma, has to be approached in a totally different perspective. The perspective we call that is either salutogenic or sanative, depending on which you've been exposed to. But the salutogenic or phasic approach is a wellness-based approach. And how you start a wellness-based approach is you have to make sure that the person is stabilized first, that they have an ability to effectively manage their own physical arousal and their own emotional arousal, and that is a process of moving people through increasing ability to do those two things. And once they're able to manage those two things, then either of the traditional approaches to treatment should work. But until they are stable enough, neither of those work. So a lot of people have never been trained in anything but neocortex centric. Colleges all over the place really push cognitive behavior therapy. It's because it's so manualized, it's it's template driven, it's curriculum driven. If you're going to teach somebody how to do therapy, this is the best avenue, because it requires the least amount of creativity on a person that's just learning. The amygdala-centric focuses, which, how are you feeling about that, and that are going for intense insight into emotional reality, those are also models that are not going to work well with highly traumatized folks because it tends to affect them negatively. So the primary difference is that you're going to have to move into more of a salutogenic approach to deal with trauma. And the more complex the trauma is, the more it's going to be necessary to use a salutogenic approach. So when you start looking at the passion of mental health these days, everybody's all about evidence-based therapy. And it's, well, what's your best practice, or what's your evidence-based practice? And the reality is that the term evidence-based practice comes from medicine, and it has the fundamental idea that there is something particularly wrong, and if you know what that thing is, you can design a treatment just for that. Well, human beings are much more complex. They don't just have a single thing that's challenging them. The other thing about evidence-based therapy structures is that they tend to promote a specific manualized approach. In other words, most evidence-based therapies, in order to be evidence-based, are highly protocoled, and there's kind of an assumption that one size will fit all, that one size or one process is good for everybody. And the people that practice that way get really frustrated because they have, let's say they have 100 clients, which is way too many for most people to have, but let's say they have 100 clients and 45 of them seem to be okay with that and the others aren't. And what has emerged in the field of mental health is those people that can't really benefit from the one-size-fits-all curriculum-based approaches to treatment tend to be vilified. Well, they're in denial, they're uncooperative or non-compliant, or they're resistant. And that's just not the case. It is what you're trying to do isn't, and the approach that you're using isn't going to work with them. Manualized means that therapy is conducted following some form of instruction. And let's be honest, if you step away from that form of instruction, you no longer have an evidence-based model of treatment. So it's only evidence-based as long as you follow the protocol. And that's problematic with people that have trauma, significant amounts of trauma in their history. So why is this problematic in trauma therapy? Manualized treatment tends to focus on deliverable protocols. Trauma therapy effectiveness relies on relational connection. In other words, if I really want to help somebody that has a trauma history thrive and move forward, it's going to be primarily built in the relationship between the therapist and the client. And that the higher the quality of that relationship, the more likely we are to get movement. However, manualized approaches to therapy de-emphasize relationship. In other words, it's about doing this process and not about really having a deep, secure therapeutic attachment to the client. This is the steps you take, you do these things, and that makes it excellent for training students, but it makes it very poor for people that have trauma histories. And so this is a challenge that we face on a fairly consistent basis. particularly with a lot of folks that come out of programs, they are so good-hearted and they want to do a good job and they're so idealistic. I just love them. I love working with them. I love getting to know them. They're wonderful. However, the only way they know how to approach it is through these manualized approaches. And when it can't be answered by the manual, they kind of freeze up or shut down and they don't know what to do. Because what's become important in the teaching of counseling and mental health services in most colleges is a process. You know, it's taught as a manual or as a curriculum rather than how do we form these deep, well-connected, secure therapeutic attachments with client. And that is often missing in the way that we instruct people. The other thing that I've run into with a lot of new folks is when they realize that that's what it takes. I've had a good number of them, you know, probably 10 or 12 in the last 5 or 6 years alone, tell me, well, I don't want to have that kind of relationship with clients. I just want to be able to do this and have them get better. Well, that's not going to work very well. The other really, the relationship really does require that a lot more of the clinician than to be able to deliver a curriculum or a manualized approach. So another reason why this is problematic for us is that you know, manualized approaches tend to be highly cognitive. In other words, they tend to be neocortex centric. And without considering that the traumatized people that they are working with often are stuck in intense emotional arousal, which means their body's in such a state that they don't have access to executive functioning. They don't have access to clear thinking. They don't have access to being able to do a number of functions that they must be able to do in order to use a neocortex focused or a neocortex centric model of treatment. Traditional and often popular models of treatment often underserve trauma clients. It's not intentional, but they inadvertently add increasing demands to an already dysregulated system. So I can't, because of the state of my body, I really can't do reality checking very well. I really can't prioritize very well. I can't really problem solve and then follow it very well because my system's so dysregulated. And so I go to work with somebody that is coming from that neocortex centric position, and those are exactly the things that they expect me to do. And without realizing it, this well-meaning, loving, caring helper has just dumped a load of demand or pressure or stress on the shoulders of this trauma client, not meaning to, really wanting to help, desperate to help, but it's not approaching it in a way that can maximize help. What they're doing is often asking clients to engage in operations that they just don't have the brain and nervous system capacity to do. And when they fail, because often they fail, the client sees that failure as evidence of their brokenness, evidence that they are really crazy. They feel shame, they feel guilt, they feel remorse because they can't do those things. Why would we do that to people? Why would we put them in a situation where we're structuring a collapse of their empowerment system because we are trying to get them to operate in a system that they cannot operate in? It doesn't make sense. So the starting point of understanding trauma is really understanding that changes in biochemistry and hormonal levels change emotions, thinking, and behavior. In other words, you have a shift in emotion, something has gone on in the chemistry of your body. And we need to understand the physiology of the body in order to work with trauma. Now, I say this all the time, and people sometimes get a little irritated with me because they say, well, I never had to take any physiology or human anatomy to be a therapist. It never seemed like I was going to need it. Yet we require almost all human services people to take human development so that they understand what is a natural evolution of growth and development is, but we don't require that they know much about this body. And let's be honest, you don't have emotions or thinking or behavior without something going on in this body. And if you don't have a good basic foundational amount of information about the physiology, then you can't possibly be adequate to work with trauma. Changes are not pathology. They are predictable, biologically correct responses. That is a huge difference between the traditional medical model that's looking for an acute problem. What's the problem? Well, they're depressed, and this is what depression looks like. Let's treat that depression. But that you can't treat depression like you can a broken bone. You've got a parallel fracture in your humerus. Boy, we know what to do with that, and it's very precise. But depression is not that precise. And most of the things that we are doing in mental health world, we're trying to treat, and we kind of wink, wink, nudge, nudge, agree that this is something solid. But the reality is, it is just not that solid. And so the idea that there is a protocol that is the best protocol for this thing is kind of unrealistic, particularly as we ramp up and add high levels of toxic stress, trauma, repeated adversity in a person's history. And finally, to work with trauma, we need to know how to address these changes in the body, how to help the client get in charge of those responses themselves so that they can manage their emotions, their thinking, and their behavior. Because as long as the body is having these unrestricted responses, or the person isn't able to modify their responses, then they're kind of enslaved to these biochemical changes. So there's a lot of chemicals that go into this. I'm going to call this the fiery cocktail. And really there's about 30 or so hormones and biochemicals involved in this process that excites the nervous system. But I'm just going to cover 3 because we have a limited amount of time. So what are the biological and hormonal changes? So if you have a large increase in noradrenaline, then you will experience, because it's biologically correct to do so. Get that? It's not bad behavior. It's not mental illness. It's not a mental disease. It is completely biologically correct responses. A large increase in noradrenaline, you will be angry, you will be aggressive, you'll be assertive, you'll be hostile, because it's biologically correct. Now, does that mean that it's not unpleasant to other people? Of course not. It's unpleasant to other people. It can be socially destructive, relationally destructive, and it can lead to engaging in behaviors that are criminal. But the problem isn't that. The problem is that if you have a large increase, these are appropriate responses, part of the survival system that's built into the human body. So we've got to stop vilifying people for having these and understand, what do we need to do to help them regulate the noradrenaline level? Adrenaline, another hormone that is part of this process. When high levels of adrenaline are in your system, when you have a large increase, you're going to feel fear and anxiety, and you're going to feel like running away and hiding, and you're going to have a reduced ability to focus on things, and you're going to be kind of twitchy and hyperactive. Why? Because that's biologically correct. Again, if you're seeing these, we're not going to pathologize fear or anxiety. What we're going to do is ask, what's going on in the body that the adrenaline levels are staying so high? So cortisol, when there's a large increase in cortisol, it has a real impact on our ability to think, emote, and to behave. It reduces our ability to reality check. It reduces our access to executive functioning. It reduces inhibition in our behavior. In other words, our stop it button gets turned off. It reduces sequential memory. It reduces logic and reason. It reduces planning and follow through. So high levels of cortisol generate completely biologically correct responses. Now, these are just 3. There's a bunch more out there. They all have an effect, but let's just focus on these 3 for just a minute. What constitutes a large increase? And because, and I mentioned it before, but I really want to come back and really focus on it right now. Human beings are designed to be environmentally responsive. If there are things going on in their external environment or in their internal environment that are generating this, these are correct behaviors. And so part of treating trauma is being able to understand and look at what's going on in these environments that they're in that keeps this system firing up. So the difference is really interesting. You know, I talk to a lot of therapists and they want to know exactly what is the point at which it's too much. And does not work that way. If you want to think of it this way, on this side, you grew up in a relatively optimal environment. Low stress, well regulated, well nurtured, warm interactions, low levels of stress, parents that were well managed themselves and managed their own stress and emotions really well. You were raised in that environment, it's going to take a lot of this stuff to blow you up. But if you were raised in a less than optimal environment where there wasn't that optimal kind of life experience, then what's happened is your body has been sensitized to react to these things more frequently. And so you don't need as much to blow you up. So on this other side, where you lived an optimal life, if you wanted to think of this as a liquid measure, you might need a whole cup of this stuff to really get that system blowing up. But over here, because of your history, because of living a less than optimal life, either as a child or as an adult or living that currently, you might only need a quarter teaspoon to get the same reaction that this one would get with a cup, you would get with a quarter teaspoon. Now, what ends up happening is we as outsiders react to the annoyance factor or we are offended by people's behavior and we become reactive to it, which means we get a good charge of these chemicals in our system in response to what other people are doing. That is one of the things that we need to be able to manage for ourselves. But this is not mental illness. This is predictable, biologically correct shifts in behavior, thinking, and emotion that are based on changes in the hormonal and biochemistry of the body. If you don't know enough about this to help your client learn to manage it, then you're not going to do great work with trauma clients for the most part. You might do some really good work with a few, but to be able to really help a broad number of them, and particularly the ones that have more complex presentations, is going to be very difficult. You have to understand the basics of physiology to do good trauma work. So very simply, negative emotions are likely to raise the levels of these hormones and biochemicals, which drives a reactive, and I'm going to call it what it is, an amygdala-centric response. In other words, it's a survival response, it's amygdala-centric, it's not logical, it's primitive. So we focus on negative emotions, we're likely to kick up activity in this system. Trying to get somebody that has a dysregulated system to think and learn is problematic because these hormones and biochemicals limit a person's access to their executive functioning system, their neocortex, meaning that learning, memory, prioritizing, reality checking are unavailable. So the two prominent ways of approaching therapy neocortex-centric or amygdala-centric won't work for a lot of trauma clients because it's putting a demand on systems they cannot regulate right now. And because they can't regulate them, the functions that are necessary to do therapy with those approaches are not going to work well. Expecting the physiological dysregulated client to perform in either amygdala-centric or neocortex-centric models of treatment and distress is already, we're actually adding more distress to an already stressed system. So I hope that makes sense. So understanding how the state of the body influences behavior, emotions, and thinking becomes really important to doing trauma work. We all understand, we've all had this experience many times in our life where our body's gone through a limbic shift, or it's moved into what we call sympathetic state dominance. You feel it when your muscles and your diaphragm constrict, your heart rate speeds up, your blood changes the way it flows, there's muscle tension, you get, an inhibition of insulin in your system, you get cold hands, feet, headaches, your muscles in your neck and shoulders tense up, even the muscles of your face change. All of these occur and they're predictable responses. They're predictable responses. You move into a limbic shift or you move into sympathetic system dominance, this is what your body's going to experience. Your body responds to these very quickly. However, this isn't all the changes that are going on. And so I want to walk you through this cycle that goes on. Almost all of us go through this cycle every day. We go from being regulated to dysregulated to re-regulated. So let me give you a simple one. You get up, you have breakfast, you're doing pretty good, you're pretty well regulated. You miss lunch, any break time, it's 4 o'clock, you're hungry, you've had a stressful day. Are you regulated as well as you were right after breakfast? No, you're not. But you get some food in you, you get re-regulated. In some of my grandchildren, we call this the hangry, because when they are hungry, they get irritable, they get reactive, they're short-tempered. Well, that's pretty normal for human beings in general. They go through this cycle: regulated, dysregulated, re-regulated. Now, how I have simplified this a little bit for clients as I've worked with them, I call it the Bruce Banner brain, Hulk brain, back to Bruce Banner brain. The problem that we run into is in being stuck in the dysregulated system. The longer and more intensely we're stuck there and we can't re-regulate, the more we begin to generate symptoms that we would consider to be trauma symptoms. So if you have clients that experience phobias, if you have clients that are OCD, you probably have people that are not getting to the re-regulated side of these. They've been regulated, they are dysregulated, they can't seem to re-regulate themselves, so their body can't settle back down. And that's really the problem, because when they're stuck in the Hulk brain, they're responding to the world in a survival response approach. Survival approaches do not include a lot of cognitive processing. They tend to be overly emotional. So again, if you have somebody that's stuck in Hulk brain, think about this: neocortex-centric therapy models are not going to help, and emotion or amygdala-centric approaches are not going to help, because you already have this person in such a state of dysregulation that has to occur first. Where we first started seeing this in the literature was actually in the beautiful work that Judith Herman did and published in the mid-90s, that you have to get people stabilized before you involve them in any form of model of treatment. And really what we're saying here, let me kind of simplify stabilization for you. Stabilization is moving them from being dysregulated into a regulated state or re-regulated state, and helping them learn to do that for themselves. then you have stability. You do not have stability until they can operate in their neocortex. So when somebody shifts into the sympathetic nervous system, there are other complete, and I want to make really sure I say this every time, these are biologically correct responses. These are not pathology. These are not mental illness. These are exactly what you should see if somebody's system has been kicked into that sympathetic dominant system. So they're going to be about this moment in time. They're not going to be future oriented at all. They're going to be impulsive. They're going to be irrational. They're going to be illogical. They're not self-reflecting. They're not self-evaluating, and they're not going to really interpret rewards very well. It doesn't matter if you move into the sympathetic system because you're having a good time or because you're in threat. When you move into the sympathetic nervous system and the hormones that are being generated with that are present, this is the way your thinking and behaving shift. It's not wrong. It's not bad. Is it difficult to be around sometimes? Yes. Is it annoying? Absolutely. But it's not wrong, it's not bad, and it's not mental illness. So let me give you an example. If you're having a great time and you're driving a go-kart, where the fun of doing that is what? It's right now. It's in this moment. It's not a logical process. It's not something that you're rational about. You're not reflecting on yourself or the situation, or you're not evaluating things. You're just having a good time, and you're trying to beat somebody else down the road. Or, you know, if you're like some of the daredevil kids I've seen, you might bounce into each other. But the reality is your entire focus is on having a good time in this moment, and all these other things just don't make any difference to you. In fact, if somebody pulled up next to you and here you are an adult in a go-kart, somebody pulls up next to you in another go-kart and they say, hey, let's talk about tax shelters and retirement planning. You're not going to be able to have that conversation, even though you may want to in this moment, because you are not in the right nervous system to do that. The same would be, imagine playing a sport of some kind. I've picked soccer here. Do you want the goalie that's protecting your goal from other people scoring? Do you want the goalie to move into self-reflection and self-evaluation in the middle of the game? I wonder if I'm a good person. Is this my highest and best use? You don't want them to be self-reflective or self-evaluating. You want them to pay attention, to focus on and be reactive in the moment to what's going on. And that is sympathetic system at work. Now, all of us at some point in our lives have been in this state of arousal, and we've made some stellar choices. I'm going to show you a clip here for a second from some kids that were jumping off their house into a pool here in the Glendale, Arizona area. And they'd been doing it for a while, and it was fun and exciting until somebody got hurt. It was fun until that moment. And she ended up in a wheelchair with 2 broken feet. Well, then we realized, what, I should have probably not done that. Or other people look at that and say, well, couldn't she see how dangerous that was? And the reality, the answer to that question is no, she could not see how dangerous it was, because in order to see how dangerous it is, you have to be adequately self-reflective. And she's not in that system at this time. How many of you have, in your more intimate relationships, have had a disagreement with a loved one? And when you're having this disagreement, are you logical? Are you reasonable? Have you planned it out? Have you thought about the impact of this on your relationship 2 years, 3 years, 5 years down the road? Have you looked at all of the things you want to say and make sure that they are fair and just and equal for both parties? Or do you just want your own damn way and you want it right now? Well, that is not rational. That is being in this sympathetic system. These are not bad behaviors. There may be negative bad consequences, but these are biologically correct responses. If you have a child that is in a state of arousal, asking them to sit down and be quiet and learn something is going to be next to impossible. And what we see a lot of adults do is get into a power struggle with that kid and try to force them to do it. And the more force they apply to it, the more difficult it is for the child to actually do that. And then we have a child in trouble because the adult can't regulate themselves well. This happens in all sorts of venues. Again, these are not bad behavior. They're not mental, they're not proof of mental illness. They are simply biologically correct responses if the body is moved into a sympathetic dominated system. So somebody that's in that system, and most trauma clients are not going to do well in the neocortex centric approaches, and they're not going to prosper in the amygdala or emotion centric processes, because both of those are just going to exacerbate the level of dysregulation. So I often kind of use this metaphor of the Hulk and Bruce Banner. Change or transformation requires that a person be in Bruce Banner mode, not the Hulk. You know, if you're familiar with the Marvel comics, you know, who's rational is not the Hulk. The Hulk is not planning and executing. Somebody did tell me in their most recent movie, he's more of a blend, but in the original concept of him, Bruce Banner is the bright one, the reasonable one, the logic one, and the Hulk is the reactive and aggressive and hostile one. If you have people that have trauma histories, quite often they're coming in the door in Hulk mode, or their system has been so overwhelmed that they have shut down completely, which we'll talk about a little bit more. And they don't have access to being able to do those two primary functions. So the two most popular approaches to dealing with psychiatric problems, the neocortex centric and the amygdala emotional centric approaches, rarely are going to prove maximally beneficial for the trauma client, because they do not go to the ground point of getting them regulated before they do anything else. So another way to explain what happens is this. Excuse me. You can think of the nervous system, particularly the brain and nervous system, as a ladder. At the top of the ladder is your executive functioning system. At the middle of the ladder is your survival, reactive, your overt, aggressive, kind of take control kind of processes. And then at the lower part of the ladder is the overwhelmed, shutdown kind of in the most primitive responses. So let's look at what happens as we move up and down the ladder. So at the top of the ladder, which is called the ventral vagal system, this part of the nervous system, when you're at the top of the ladder, you seek attachment, you seek social connection, you use reason and logic, you can plan and follow through, you can self-evaluate, you can self-regulate, you can self-reflect, and that's at the top of the ladder. And you can be assertive and kind, self-reflective, genuine, you can have good relationships, you can improve your immune function, and you're resilient. In the middle of the ladder, when the sympathetic nervous system is dominant, this is a mobilization system to help you fight or run away. And the behaviors we see in this one are aggression and anger and controlling behaviors. We see a lot of use of sarcasm and threats and name calling and intimidation to gain control, running away and fleeing. Well, how many of you are dealing with people that are engaging in those behaviors on a pretty regular basis, they're in the middle of the ladder. They can't benefit from most of therapy that we can offer until they can get to the top of the ladder. What are you doing before you ever start a model of treatment to get them up the ladder? Now, we also have folks that are at the bottom of the ladder. They're in their dorsal vagal system. This system is trying to conserve energy. If I don't conserve energy, I may die. It's what we consider a passive or anesthetized system. And the attributes of this one you're going to see when people numb out, shut down, hide, feel small. They emotionally distance themselves from others. They try to avoid notice. They don't want to be seen. They try to withhold thoughts and feelings and ideas. They don't want to be seen, and because that's dangerous for them. And so we have folks at all three places, but each and every one of us move up and down this all the time. Where we start trauma therapy at is wherever they are. Our goal is to help them develop the skills to move up to the top of the ladder. And once they're at the top of the ladder, once they're able to be in the ventral vagal system, they're regulated well enough that if they need therapy at that point, they can benefit from the therapy models that are popular. But until they're at the top of the ladder, they really can't benefit from neocortex-centric or amygdala-centric models of treatment. When you are in the middle or bottom of the ladder, how do you think and emote or feel? Just think about yourself. If you think about that continuum, how willing are you to give control to somebody else when you're in the middle of the ladder? You're feeling out of control. You're feeling kind of uncertain. How many of you have gotten kind of aggressive or assertive and kind of threatened others or intimidated people or bullied your way through because that's the state you were in? If we understand that that's what's really going on, it allows us to see people in a much more compassionate view. We see them as people that have a biology that's out of sync, that is out of balance, rather than seeing a person engaging in bad behavior. Additionally, how likely would it be to believe that other people's needs, wants, or demands are fair if you are in that middle part of the ladder or the lower part of the ladder? If you're down there and you're in that sympathetic dominant state, or you're in the dorsal vagal state, are you going to see other people as actually being reasonable in what they want? And are you going to care about what their needs are? The reality is you're not going to care what their needs are. And so, we use a lot of shame on people in our society. A few weeks ago, I was in a grocery store and saw a mother with, I think both of them were her kids. They looked like they were about 4 and 6. And the older one, I guess, had been deviling the younger one. And she yells at that kid and she said, "Can't you see how bad this makes your brother feel?" And the reality is, mom she is totally toasty at that point. She's not regulated well enough to have this discussion with a child, and she's being reactive herself. But the child that's in that level of arousal doesn't care about other people's needs. It's about what they do, what they want. The same is true if you're in an argument with a loved one. Their needs are not what's important right now. It doesn't mean that if you were calm, you wouldn't think that their needs were important. But when you're in that middle or lower part of the ladder, you don't care what other people's needs are, or you don't care consistently what they are, because yours aren't being met. How difficult has it been for you to behave rationally with logic and reason when you find yourself in the middle or lower parts of the ladder? This is not a mental illness issue. This is a human life issue. We all move up and down this. Now, what happens with people that have a lot of traumas in their history, or they're exposed to a lot of toxic stress or repetitive adversity, is they tend to stay in the middle or lower parts of the ladder. and they tend to live their whole life in that kind of a way. And it's incredibly unhealthy for them, and it's terrible on their relationships, but it does not make them mentally ill, and it does not make them bad people. What it takes is an understanding of us looking at this and saying, this is a biological response. How can we help them move past this? How much patience can you exercise when you're in the middle or the bottom part of the ladder? And I think if you're honest in answering those questions for yourself, you realize that a lot of times what you're dealing with in clients are the same things you deal with in your own life. But it's so much easier to think that they are broken and damaged, or they're diseased, or they're mentally ill, than to really deal with the physiology. How do we get that physiology regulating well enough so that they aren't at the middle or bottom of the ladder anymore? So why do we need the Bruce Banner brain? Why do we need to be at the top of the ladder? So the things that are only accessible to us at the top of the ladder. Now, I want you to look at this really carefully because it's important. The only time you have access to these things I'm going to go through is when you are at the top of the ladder. Or let's say, you may have access to some of them, but you're not going to access them well. They're not going to be very functional for you unless you're at the top of the ladder. So let's look at these. First one, you're not going to be able to self-regulate. You're not going to have much self-compassion. You're not going to have much self-awareness. You're not going to be able to use moral valuing of any kind. You're not going to have self-control. You're not going to be able to plan. You're not going to do reality checking well. You're not going to be able to inhibit or stop yourself very well. You're not going to be able to grow intentionally. And you're not going to be very resilient. Those are typically what we're dealing with. If someone is not in Bruce Banner brain, they can't do these things. So let me ask you, for you yourself, which of these don't you think you need? Can you get rid of all of them and still grow and be the kind of person you want to be? Yet, again, if you're going to use either of the traditionally popular forms of therapy, the neocentric, the neocortex-centric, or the amygdala emotion-centric approaches, these are the things that have to be in place for you to use those. So what we're saying, unless they're at the top of the ladder, the most popular form of treatment cannot work well. And that's problematic. So how does trauma get created then? If trauma isn't a big bad event, what is it? And so we look at this in a little different way. Each of us have a range of tolerance. And as long as we stay within that range of tolerance, we are relatively resilient to our life experiences. Now, what happens? We have a stressor, we have a demand, we have, unfortunate things that happen to us, we have adversity, and we get a charge of these chemicals in our system, and the chemicals, as they build in this system, will push us above the upper threshold of this. They'll push us over the upper range of this. However, the other thing that people forget is that this isn't fixed. The range of tolerance is in a constant state of fluctuation for every living human being. Let me give you an example. You're a mom of 3 children and you come home with a baby and the baby isn't sleeping very well. About your 3rd or 4th night of not getting very much sleep, how is it changing your behavior towards your other children? Are you more snappy? Are you more angry? Are you fussier with them? Are you more picky about things? Of course you are, because your body doesn't have the tolerance it did because your body is being impacted. Or how many of you have noticed that, generally you're pretty good natured about things, but when you have a bad cold, you get snappy or impatient with people. This range of tolerance, the number one thing that affects it is the health and state of the body at this moment. So that's going to fluctuate all day long. Now, then you have these stressors that come, and every stressor dumps a bit of the fiery cocktail into your system. And when the fiery cocktail reaches enough level of it in your system, there's enough saturation, if you will, in your system, you begin to move towards that upper threshold. And as you move across the threshold, you have moved into Hulk mode, and you're now becoming reactive and defensive, and you're going to try to do the things that you can to manage this situation. If this persists very long, what's going to happen is your body's going to kick into naturally predictive mitigation or adaptive responses. A reactive mitigation might be shut down, disconnect, disassociate, distract, use something so I don't have to feel, engage in some kind of behavior that allows me not to have to feel the way I'm feeling anymore. And there's any number of ways that can work. Or I might get aggressive and hostile, and I might name call. I'm going to move into those reactive adaptations because I'm trying to take control of the situation. The reality is that as you move to the upper range of tolerance and beyond it, you're moving out of a balanced central nervous system. In other words, you're losing your Hulk brain, you're losing your Bruce Banner brain and moving into a Hulk brain. So how long will these hormones and biochemicals be out of balance? That's kind of an important thing to ask, because a lot of people think, well, you know, that happened 10 minutes ago, they should be fine. And that's not true. So I might have a bad thing happen to me, and 15, 20 minutes later, I may be able to talk about it, but my body isn't back to a normal state until those chemicals are metabolized. So how long should that take? This part of the problem with this is it's very unique to the individual. And again, I'm going to break it down in kind of very simplistic terms. If I have lived a relatively optimal life, then I'm going to metabolize this pretty quickly. Now, don't get carried away. Pretty quickly is still not it's not a very short time. In other words, I will metabolize these chemicals relatively quickly. If I have a long background of having this kind of arousal frequently, my body is going to metabolize this more slowly. And I want you to think about the economy of the body. Over here, you don't have this happen very often, and so your body can kick in and really kind of bring you back into balance relatively quickly. Over here, it happens quite often, so the body is going to put a minimal amount of effort into bringing you back, because otherwise, in just a few minutes, you're going to get another dose. And a few minutes after that, you're going to get another dose of the fiery cocktail. And so it's much slower. So the range between the fast and the slow, while you can function pretty well in 20 to 30 minutes, but the body requires more time to completely metabolize that. And that is complicated by the history of trauma, toxic stress, and adversity. And the short end is roughly 6 hours, and the long end is roughly 30. Now, in 20, 30 minutes, you may be able to speak clearly, but your body is still in a state of arousal until it's completely metabolized. And we've all experienced this. We just didn't realize that's what was happening. When my kids were little and they would do something that would irritate me, sometimes it was, you know, I could take it in stride and just think it was funny. I might even laugh about it because it wasn't that big a deal. But I've had a lot of stressors during the week. I've had a lot of challenges. I had a couple of adverse things happen. And now they do the same exact thing and I blow up. It's like a nuclear explosion. What's the difference? It isn't the nature of that behavior that's changed. It isn't the nature of what that behavior means that's changed. It is my system is so aroused that another dose, even a small dose of this, is enough to blow me up. So what the medical term for this we call this, as long as you haven't metabolized the entire load of these fiery chemicals in your system, you're in what we call a kindled state. And the kindled state means that you are more ready to react. Think of kindling. It's ready to catch fire. Your nervous system is in a kindled state as long as you haven't metabolized this stuff. Well, you think about some of the clients you work with. How many of them go 30 hours without getting a dose of the fiery cocktails? How many of them even go 6 hours without getting a dose of the fiery cocktail? And we wonder why they're having problems getting regulated well enough to do therapy with us. When the nervous system is out of balance, these are some of the attributes, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but when you're not in Bruce Banner mode, when you're in the Hulk mode or you're in the dorsal vagal system, you're going to have a tendency to use binary or rigid black and white thinking. You're going to have many internal negative dialogues. You're going to tend to be overly focused on finding pain and hurt and disappointment in each situation you're in. You're not going to have any tolerance for delayed gratification. You're going to be impulsive, irrational, illogical. You're not going to do much self-evaluation or reflection. You're going to have difficulty reality checking. You're going to have a difficulty stopping yourself from doing some behavior that you don't want to do. You're going to have difficulty using logic and reason. You're going to have difficulty or an impairment in your ability to evaluate rewards. You're going to have the development of an excessive amount of shame and guilt. You're going to feel worthless quite often. You're going to feel very vulnerable and fearful. These are just natural responses to having that system out of balance. Now, what we've been trained in the mental health world to do is to see these as the problem, but these are a manifestation of an out of balance nervous system. And we haven't really taken the next step and say, okay, ignore these for a minute, and what do we need to do to get that system in balance? Because when the system is in balance, you don't have these problems. Did you catch that? Balanced system, these aren't the problem. Unbalanced system, these are the problem. We need the central nervous system to be in balance. And that means we need to be in Bruce Banner mode. We need to have a balance between that parasympathetic and the sympathetic system. They need to be working in kind of tandem and collaboratively back and forth. We don't want one or the other to really be in the dominant role. We want them to be kind of a unity of that. And that's what we're looking for. Because when that slips out of that unity, we get these kinds of situations and problems. So essentially, whenever the brain is not integrating well, in other words, we're not in Bruce Banner mode, there's three primary systems that are being disrupted. The first one is what we call the human default network system. That's a term that Stephen Porges and Deb Dana use in the work around the polyvagal system. And basically what it is recognizing and assigning meaning and emotion to experience. That the ability to process and encode what is relevant into memory. The ability to think and project into the future. Also, what we call the salience relevance system is kind of broken or damaged. It's hard to determine what is most important and tend to focus on that in any environment. We tend to be behavioral or reaction-oriented engine at those moments. And finally, we have a disruption in the executive functioning network. We have difficulty planning for the future. We have difficulty reality checking and problem solving. And we have a difficulty concentrating or focusing our attention on a desired outcome. So again, if your client is in a physiologically aroused state, either they're in sympathetic or dorsal vagal systems, they're either in the middle or the bottom of the ladder, they are not good candidates for the two primary modalities of traditional therapy. They are not going to be very effective in the neocortex-centric approaches, and they're not going to be very good and the amygdala emotion-centric processes. So again, why is that problematic? Because we are not training therapists very well on how to help people manage their body, because we don't require that they have a good amount of physiology as part of their background. Does knowing this information help you reframe communication? Think about it. What kind of questions are you going to ask differently? Instead of probing into a behavior and seeing it as a problem, you're going to start looking at what's going on in the environment that's triggering this response in the body. And it's just an entirely different mindset. So what does all this mean for us? It means that traditional, popular talk therapies that tend to be either cognitive in orientation or they tend to be emotion oriented, while there's a lot of good work around those, there's been a lot of research to develop them, they are not bad models of treatment. But for your trauma client, if you move into those before the client is stable and in a balanced central nervous system, or they're able to function in Bruce Banner mode, you're underserving the client and actually stand a good chance of hurting them. So they're not bad models. I'm not saying don't use them. I am not saying that at all. Cognitive behavior, I love cognitive behavior approaches, but I don't use them until my client has the ability to regulate themselves. I like some of the emotion-focused stuff. Again, when do you use it? When they're able to regulate themselves. Trying to use either of those traditionally popular approaches when you have somebody that is in full-blown Hulk mode is counterproductive. And what we end up doing is making that person feel horrid about themselves, shamed about their progress, feel like a failure, and we actually inhibit their growth and their ability to change. So talk therapy tends to be amygdala activating and focused. I talked a little bit about being kindled, the tendency of some regions of the brains to stay reactive. I don't need to spend any more time on that one. But if you want to know some interesting work around this, you may want to read some of the work of Daniel Amen, Daniel Siegel, Dr. Martin Teacher, certainly Steve Porges, Alan Shore. A lot of us that have this trauma kind of understanding, Deb Dana, Jania Fisher, Bessel van der Kolk. Being kindled is a biologically correct process. And when people are kindled, they behave as biologically appropriate. So what we're dealing with quite often is, and I'm going to kind of break this up into thirds, if you will. What is traumatizing? There's high intense environmental activation. This would be considered episodic. And these are the kinds of witnessing, these are the kinds of things that that would be. Witnessing or experiencing domestic violence, sexual assault, witnessing war, being part of a military theater, actions, accidents, bad injuries. That's episodic. And most of the way we've defined trauma at least in the United States, and I think in any culture that uses a DSM or ICD system kind of defines it this way. But we also are struggling, and probably most of your clients that are going to be coming in to see you for trauma have low intensity, high frequency environmental activations. In other words, they don't have a lot of these big bad events, but they have constant, daily, multiple times of a day stressors that overwhelm them. And then you have, that these are chaotic environments, aggressive environments, inconsistent practices. These are cumulative over time. Then you have the low intensity continual. These are where it's not very strong, but it just never goes away. Where I've seen this one is trauma responses, for example, from being a caregiver, long-term caregiver for an invalid, or a lot of times with parents that are raising children that are physically impaired in some way, particularly mentally impaired, there's a lot of trauma that's related to that, because it's a constant, the constancy of it begins to wear down their system. So we're always looking at trauma from this perspective. Was it intense? Was it frequent? How long did it last? And if you have long duration, you don't need to be very intense. If you have a lot of frequency, you also don't need it to be very intense. If you have a lot of frequency, you also don't need it to last very long each time. So these are unique and individual of themselves. But when we start looking at working with somebody that has a trauma history, we need to kind of understand what it is we're really dealing with. So the term that we use for this is traumagenesis. This is the repeated activation of the threat stress response system that drives reactive adaptation. In other words, it's driving completely correct responses. The nervous system becomes overly activated on a chronic basis, and it's a cumulative harm effect, that it's over the top so often that it's beginning to adversely affect the body. And some of the areas, and I'm not going into them in this presentation, but you have the hormonal system that's affected, you have the genetic expression affected, you have the immune system affected, you have the endocrine system affected. You're going to have all of these systems being affected with this accumulation of harm in the body. Activation does not require abuse, abandonment, physical or sexual hurts. All it requires is the body to be put into a stressed state and kept in a stressed state. The natural responses, particularly if they are moving into the dorsal version of this, is avoidance or aggression and sympathetic, or disassociation and freezing in the dorsal. These are automatic responses. They are not bad. They're not wrong. There's unfortunate consequences to them, but they are not wrong. So again, environments that throw the nervous system out of balance, chaotic environments. Let's just stop for a second. How many of the environments that you're in every day are chaotic? How many of the environments you're in every day are aggressive or punitive or inconsistent? I ask when I train teachers, usually these first four describe most schools. And I say, well, if you have a child that's coming to school and they're already in an aroused state, you're setting them up to fail by the environment being this way. How can you change the environment? And of course, they look at you like, well, we can't, because we have to do what we have to do. Well, and that's not true. Until they can change the environment, they have very little opportunity and chance to really calm a child well enough to be able to learn and function well. And then there's these other things that can also be a part of that. So evidence-based psychological treatment, again, neocortex and amygdala-centric are what are labeled as pathogenic approaches. In other words, they look at a person being broken and damaged. They do not address environmental, whole person, lifestyle, or prevention. It is a laser focus on problems. And generally, they're problems that are creating difficulty for someone else. The kid that's having trouble paying attention in school because his system is so jacked up, he can't sit still, and because children try to calm themselves through talking, he overtalks or she overtalks. Now she's in trouble with the teacher, and the teacher gets into a power struggle with this child, and she's expecting this child whose system is just cooking to sit quietly, pay attention, and behave and learn. That's an irrational belief system. We do much the same thing in therapy. By being overly focused on problems and deficits, we are not looking for how do we help create wellness for these people. Pathogenic focuses on acute symptoms, which in medical terms is great because it means that there is a cause, usually localized to an organ or a system of the body, that can be fixed. Human beings don't operate that way. outside of that purely physical medical approach. What has developed in the world of mental health is a pathogenic view of emotions, thinking, and behavior, assuming that there is a specific, significant, acute problem that can be addressed and resolved. If I'm having an anxiety response, you may give me medication, but what's going on in the environment on a regular basis that's keeping that system jacked up? Are you underserving the client because you aren't addressing the environment or helping them kind of learn skills to help regulate themselves? They still may need medication, but they may not need as much of it, or they may not need it as often, or they may actually be able to be free of it if we can help them calm that system down. So the paradigm for modern psychiatry is evidence-based medicine. And we've talked about it several times in different ways today, so I don't know that I need to belabor it. But human being having a broken bone that is a single problem that can be fixed, or having a virus, which we've all become very familiar with in the COVID-19 life that we're living right now. If you contract a virus, you're going to get a very specific set of diseases, a very specific disease set. It's going to have pronounced symptoms. When you're talking about emotion and thinking and behavior, there is not that one-to-one relationship, and believing that you do is kind of problematic. So I've given several really good articles that address that as a resource on this page. Trauma treatment, if you're going to focus on good trauma treatment, I have what I call the 4 points that need to be kind of addressed. The first one is that you have to have a different thought process. You have to move into that salutogenic person, that approach, looking at a person as a complex being. You have to look at what's necessary to create health and realize that every single human being is multifaceted, and they're living in a multifaceted, complex life, and single events aren't the drivers for the most part. That the salutogenic is not designed for acute pathology. In other words, we aren't saying we're going to fix this problem. What we're doing is, how do we design a way of helping the whole person deal with change and improvement and growth? And then finally, truly trauma-informed approaches are all salutogenic, not pathogenic. This is one of the big problems with getting companies, mental health companies, to move into a trauma-informed approach, is that trauma-informed approaches really are not very congruent with the evidence-based medicine model. And they want people to be treated as unique individuals, and they want them to be cared for individually. And the way the mental health world has emerged is very factory oriented. They come in, we do this, this is how we do it. We give them this therapy, we give them this drug, and we move them through it. And what's happened over the last 45, 50 years is the relationship piece in public systems particularly has been increasingly lost, and it's become more mechanistic, and we have people not being served very well. In the 1950s, George Kelly's personal construct theory, which a lot of people don't pay much attention to, but essentially what we focus on, we see more of, which is a trap for those that have been trained traditionally in mental health therapy, because you've been trained to see people as damaged or with deficits or with diagnosable symptoms rather than seeing the person. And so what you get more of, what you get is more of the same. It's really interesting. You look at file after file in any clinic that I know of, or that I've been involved in auditing, and you see that anybody that comes into services, the number of diagnoses grow, the number of different medications they get on grows, because we're still trying to treat a specific acute problem, but the reality is it's not a specific acute problem. Acuity has nothing to do with what's usually going on. And acuity is just a natural byproduct of the response that's going on in the body. And we haven't done a really good job of educating people to that. And that's one of the reasons that trauma therapy using traditional models of treatment often fail for trauma clients. When the body moves into sympathetic system dominance, what are some of the responses? So the moment when they begin to move into Hulk, language ability reduces, logic and reason shift away, moral reasoning lessens, reacting to perceptions, not reality checking, ruled by their history or impulse rather than being intentional, poor impulse control, memory gaps and partial memory, and problems with sequential memory. It's hard to do either neocortex focused or amygdala focused therapy responses if these are deficits they are currently possessing. When the body moves into sympathetic, these are the correct responses. And while we've been trained in the mental health world to see many of these as the problem, these are just symptoms of what's going on in the body. And the question needs to be, what do we need to do to get the body settled down? What do we need to do to get the body relaxed? What do we need to do to get Bruce Banner back into the room or to get to the top of the ladder? And we often are not asking that question. We're just trying to deal with the acuity. And a lot of times the reason that we're dealing with acuity because it's annoying somebody, and by my goodness, we don't want somebody to be annoyed. The dorsal vagal system, if people are at the bottom of the ladder, you're going to see them freeze and dissociate and emotionally numb and distract, use a lot of self-soothing, addictions and self-injury and suicidality and compulsive behaviors. You're going to see a reluctance to try new things. You're going to see a lot of sadness and withdrawal. You're going to see a lot of emotional, psychological distancing. Why? Because it's biologically correct. If you're going to deal with these, you have to deal with getting them into a balanced central nervous system. So the reality of trauma work is this: you've got to stop seeing biologically, physiologically correct responses as pathology and focus on helping the client calm the sympathetic and dorsal vagal systems before you take any other action. If once you get them into a calm system, you may find that they don't need any therapy, but if they do need therapy, which is going to be a significant number of people are going to need therapy, if they do need therapy, now they have the wherewithal to benefit from what you like, the neocortex focused or the amygdala focused, because now they have the ability to be in their executive functioning system and actually do those. But as long as that system is out of balance, they are not going to function well. You cannot do therapy with the Hulk. I hope I've been really clear about that. You need the skills to invite and keep a person in Bruce Banner mode. If you don't have those skills, you may want to look into somatic experiencing types of therapy backgrounds. There's lots of really good ones out there. You might want to read some of the materials by Babette Rothschild or Pat Ogden or Peter Levine that have really pioneered a lot of this. But you really have to be able to work with people that are not in reason and logic, and working with the body and understanding how the body works. You also want to be able to understand more of the science of this. So you may want to make sure that you've read and understand pretty well the polyvagal system. Deb Dana put out a great book last year using the polyvagal theory in trauma therapy. It is a wonderful book. I recommend it to you because it will help you be able to do this. Also, Louis Cozolino out of California has written several books that relate to using the neuroscience to support what we do in therapy. He talks about it in very accessible ways, and I would recommend those to you. Why don't these traditional, very popular models of therapy work? I want you to think about where a lot of them were developed. Cognitive behavior models of treatment were developed on college campuses with college students who are in the time of their life where they are very cognitive, where the learning is the standard process. So it made sense that those would be evidence-based practices. Even the emotion-focused things, for the most part, were developed in college campuses with relatively stable college students. So when you're dealing with a population that's fairly well regulated, then those things work fabulously. Of course, they're evidence-based. It isn't until you are dealing with an aroused Hulk system, or if you want to, middle or lower parts of the ladder, that we don't prepare we don't prepare our mental health professionals for. They aren't equipped quite often to be able to do that kind of work. So I hope this has been a helpful presentation for you. I hope that I've kind of triggered some thought processes. If you're curious about some of the other offerings that we have at Arizona Trauma Institute, please go to www.aztrauma.org, and you will find a number of classes that we offer, both in live classes and online classes. And feel free to email us questions, or if you want to know about some resources, we'd be glad to respond to those questions as well. Again, I thank you so much for your time. I hope this has been something that's useful to you and you can share with other folks if you wish. And with that, I'm going to close up and wish you a good day. Thank you so much.